This video is about the pivot operator. This operator reshapes data. It's often used to turn many transactions recorded against a single entity into a single row that summarizes all the transactions for that entity. So, for example, transactions such as purchases by a customer may often be recorded as multiple examples, and the pivot operator can be used to combine all the purchases into a single example for that customer. So what we'll look at, we'll first of all look at some transaction data, some fake transaction data, and then we'll apply the pivot operator to it. There is a mini gotcha, which is what this aggregating point is here. It's important to understand that how the pivot operator works and how to get around a certain behavior by doing an aggregation before the pivot. Having done that, we'll then look at some of the additional parameters of the pivot operator. So here's the process. It makes some fake transaction data, and I'm changing the names of things and setting a role. We'll come back to that later, and let's set a breakpoint here just to get a flavour of what the data is. So it's a simple 100 rows. Basically it's showing what a customer designated by an ID buys, and basically there are 15 customers and they buy something like 10 items. So you see this first one, customer 1 has bought one item 9. And by sorting here you get to see this is what customer 1 has bought across all 100 transactions. So the pivot operator is simply going to change it so that we get one row for each customer and then one attribute, which is the amount of each of those items the customer bought. So we'll do that by going down this route here. So there is an aggregate operator here. We'll come back to that. That's the top route here. But the bottom one is the original data, which would be the unchanged data coming out of the aggregate operator. I'm going to pivot it and then change all the missing values here to 0. We'll come to that shortly. So the pivot operator, what we're doing is we're grouping by customer, which is what this is showing here, and we're going to use the identifier for the thing that's bought as part of the name in the new attributes that are created. Best thing to do, let's just look at that. So we're setting a breakpoint on the pivot operator at the bottom here. So here's the original data, and we'll focus on ID1, customer ID1, and here's the result. And if I hit all column widths, we can see ID1 has bought some item 1, some item 2, some 4, some 8, and some 9, and it doesn't know, it can't find any 3, 5, 6, 7, and 10 items, so these are set to missing. Later on we'll put those to 0 because that's logically correct in this example. But let's just focus ourselves on these here, and you can see this is the gotcha that requires the aggregate. So if I add up these, the customer has bought 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things. However, if I look at the original data, the sum of those is in fact 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's 2 missing, and the reason for that is because there are 3 item 9s. So the pivot operator is using the last encountered item to dictate what the resulting example set is. In other words, the last item 9 it sees has a value of 1 here, which is what this is. Moving up, the last item 8 is 2, which is this one, and the others 4, 2, and 1. 4, 2, and 1 are there. And see, these item 9s have been essentially overwritten by subsequent item 9s. So it's not incorrect behavior, it's just you have to know about it in order to avoid it can be a subtle problem if you don't realize it's there. So if we run that process to the end, this is the result of applying a replace missing values to those items that were missing in the original. So this represents a summary of what that customer bought, subject to the gotcha of aggregation, which we'll cover in a moment. So now let's look at this aggregate operator. So what we're doing in this situation, we're grouping by the customer and what he or she bought, and we're going to use in the aggregation attribute the sum of the things he bought. So the result of that is like so. And now you can see the customer has bought, the combination rather of the customer and what he or she bought now results in a smaller number of rows, but this amount here now is a sum of the total, and you can now correctly see that ID 1 and item 9 has a sum of 3, which represents the 3 item 9s in the original input data. You can see that here. So that, and that have been summed to produce that. Now if we just let the thing rip, we can now see that we actually get now a true reflection of the thing we're really interested in. Now you can see ID 1 correctly bought 1 item 1, 1 item 2, 1 item 4, 2 item 8 and 3 item 9. And as before, I've changed the missing values to have the value 0 by using this replace missing values with the default set to 0. So you can see that by this method we actually can get a nice summary of the 15 customers and what they've bought. Okay, so let's go back to look at some of the other things you can do. So other parameters, so there are 2 other parameters. One is called consider weights. Now if you have a weight attribute, you can actually get some additional calculations being performed as the pivot happens. It's actually doing a sort of a mini aggregation. I won't show it to you, it's quite advanced, but if you had a weights set for each example in the example set, then you could do a sum or a count or some sort of statistical operation, and you'd essentially get after the pivot you essentially will get an aggregated view of the weight column, which is quite interesting, but I've never had to use it. Skip constant attributes, that as the help shows, if the pivot operator determines that there's an attribute that doesn't change for a particular value of a group, and a group being a customer in this case, then that is deemed to be uninteresting and is discarded. Now I turn that to off because I always want to keep that, but it's important to bear that in mind because the default I think is to have that on. So let's do one more thing. So you may have noticed here I'm setting the role of customer to be regular. The original its role is ID. So if I disable that and run the process again, we'll see some subtle differences in the way it works. Now you'll notice that in the pivot operation where there's no aggregation beforehand, you'll notice that the customer is completely missing now from the output. And that's not the case when we're doing the aggregated view, or rather we're pivoting on the aggregated view. I think this is because the customer is a special role, and because we're seeing duplicates as the pivoting is going on, it's getting confused and is deleting or not rendering the actual customer attribute. So this is, I suppose, an important point. Just be a bit careful. If you find your customer, if your ID rather, is not appearing in the output, it might indicate that this aggregation gotcha has reared its head. Anyway, let's put that back. Okay, so this is then, I'll run through one more time, and what we'll do is we'll look at the raw data and the pivoted data after the aggregation. So this is the pivoted data. This is the raw data after the aggregation, and this is the pivoted data. I'll just highlight. Hopefully you can see, you can exercise for the reader to see how each of the values here have made it through to the pivot result.